Loaded up on YouTube. All right, we're all set to go.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first virtual meeting of 2021, the Burlingame City Council on the 4th of January. I hope everyone had a wonderful holiday. And so I am going to actually start out and have our city clerk review our public participation guidelines.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So a few things. We ask that you keep yourself on mute and your video off unless you're called on to speak. There will be a couple times to do public comment. So you can comment on an item or just on whatever you need to speak about by either Zoom chatting. That'll go directly to me and I'll read your comment out. Or you can email me at publiccomment@burlingame.org, or your last option is to raise your hand, which is a little feature in the participants window. And that'll alert us that you would like to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Megan. We will go to numeral number 2 on the agenda, which is the Pledge of Allegiance. And I will have our city manager, Lisa Goldman, start the Pledge of Allegiance for us.
Here we have our flag. Okay, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. Now, Megan, can you please do roll call?
Councilmember Beach.
Here.
Councilmember Coulson.
Here.
Councilmember Brownrigg.
Here.
Vice Mayor Ortiz. Not here. And Mayor O'Brien.
Here. I know Vice Mayor Ortiz contacted me earlier today and our city manager just to let us know that he's had a lot of internet issues today. So unfortunately, we won't have him here this evening. We did not have a closed session this evening, so we'll go right into our upcoming events. And I'm going to start out with some Park and Rec events. First, the Panthers Sports Camp and Winter Elementary Middle School Sports starts on Monday, January 11th, as long as the weather is okay. The Recess After School Program childcare starts back also on the 11th of January. So if you are interested, please contact the Rec Division to sign up for these programs. All in-person activities do follow the health department protocols to ensure the safety of all our participants. The next adult virtual coffee and conversations is on Thursday, this Thursday, January 7th at 10:30 a.m. Call 558-7300 to get the link. And then finally, senior activity packets are available monthly. So if you call 558-7300, you can have one mailed to your home. In regard to library events, we have donations actually for the Burlingame Library Foundation. Books, DVDs, CDs that are in excellent condition can be dropped off at 240 Lorton Avenue. I would like to thank Dewey Land Company for donating the space and while the library is closed. So donations are done by appointment only. So the appointments are on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays between 2 and 3. I also wanted to remind everyone that the library is still offering a robust but safe outreach program to deliver library materials to anyone who is homebound. So you can call 558-7400 and then someone will get you in contact with the outreach coordinator and get those books delivered for you. I just want to remind people that Recology will be collecting the holiday trees at curbside. So from now until the end of the month. So just please put your tree out on your regular collection day. And then there is the annual chamber luncheon virtually, which will be on the 15th of January from 11 to 12:15. Individual tickets are $50 and checks are payable to the Burlingame Chamber of Commerce. And you can set it to 417 California Drive. If you want to purchase a virtual table or sponsor, you can actually call the Chamber of Commerce and you can reach them at 650-344-1735. And then lastly, I wanted to mention that I think the council received an email from a constituent, Miss Lang, that was asking if the city of Burlingame could commemorate the presidential inauguration. We can't have a real discussion about this since it was not agendized. So unfortunately, we won't be able to do that. However, in talking with the city manager earlier today, we think we can put something in the e-news saying that there is a nationwide moment of unity and remembrance on the 19th of January at 2:30 Pacific time. So this would give people the option to take some time to remember lives that have been lost to COVID-19 and or people that have been hospitalized and have suffered with COVID-19. And so I just wanted to tell that to my colleagues. And I'm hoping we can get that in the e-newsletter as soon as possible. Is there anything else that my colleagues would like to add that I may have forgotten? Councilmember Beach.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just a reminder to everyone, Caltrans has extended the public comment deadline for the ECR Alternatives website. It was going to end in December, but it's through this Friday, January 8th. Folks can go to the website and learn about possible project alternatives and learn about the status of the project. So ECR Alternatives, for those who haven't had a chance to do so by this Friday, January 8th. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Beach. Anyone else? Okay, if not, we do not have any presentations this evening, so we'll go right into public comment. So members of the public may speak about any item not on the agenda. Members of the public wishing to suggest an item for a future council agenda may do so during this public comment period. The Ralph M. Brown Act prohibits the City Council from acting on any matter that is not on the agenda. So to our city clerk, did you receive any emails from the public?
I received no emails and I have no Zoom chats.
Okay.
I do see Councilmember Brownrigg's hand up.
Okay, very good. Councilmember Brownrigg.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I just want to take a minute. You would think after 10 years of transitions, I would have learned how the whole ceremonial transition thing worked. And yet I found myself in our last meeting having missed my opportunity to just say a couple of brief words about Councilmember Beach and her year as mayor. And I just want to thank Councilmember Beach for handling a very difficult year. I think collectively we were incredibly creative with some of the programs that she recited. But I want to thank her personally for taking that on, for working shoulder to shoulder with our city manager to help explain, our issues and our priorities with our crucial employees. And in particular, I want to thank Emily for handling a huge amount of constituent mail. We have the practice in Burlingame that the mayor responds on behalf of everybody. And we've all done this job. And I am quite sure Emily handled in 1 year, the volume I handled in 2. So, and always with grace and detail and usually some sort of answer for the constituent. And that just reflects well on all of us. It reflects well on our city. So I did want to belatedly thank Mayor Beach, or then Mayor Beach, now Councilmember Beach, for her service in a very difficult year.
Thank you, Councilmember Brownrigg.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, if not, we'll move on to the consent calendar. Is there anyone that would like to pull an item off? Okay, I will pull off item 8B, which is the council assignments. I just have one comment. There's something that should have been taken off and it wasn't, so I will bring that up. To the city clerk, is there anyone from the public that wanted to pull a consent item off?
No, there are no items to pull off from the public.
Okay, very good. So can I get a motion for the consent calendar without item 8B, please?
So moved.
Second?
Motion made by Councilmember Brownrigg, seconded by Councilmember Beach. If we can have a roll call, City Clerk?
Councilmember Beach,
Aye.
Councilmember Coulson,
Yes.
Councilmember Brownrigg,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Ortiz is absent, so Mayor O'Brien.
Yes. Motion passes 4-0-1. All right, item 8B. I just wanted to make one correction because at the time when I submitted this, the vote had not been done for the Council of Cities Domestic Violence Council, the alternate. I will not be the alternate from Burlingame. We're actually have Christine Krolik from, so we can actually take that off of our assignments.
Will do.
Okay, so would someone like to make a motion on item 8B, please?
To approve item 8B, committee assignments for,
Okay, I think we have a motion from Council Member Coulson. Do I have a second?
Second.
Seconded by Council Member Brownrigg. Megan, could we have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Beach,
Yes.
Councilmember Coulson,
yes.
Councilmember Brownrigg,
Yes.
Mayor O'Brien.
Yes, motion passes 4-0-1. Okay, we do not have any public hearings this evening, so that will lend us into item number 10A, and that's the adoption of a resolution authorizing the city manager to enter into a professional services agreement with redistricting partners for the purpose of transitioning from at-large to by district council member elections. And I think we will have our city clerk give this report this evening.
Correct, Mayor. So I'll just begin with a brief background on this item, and then I'm going to turn it over to Paul Mitchell from Redistricting Partners, who will describe the districting process to all of you. I think it's important to note that the discussion for tonight is not on the merits of district elections, but rather to recommend approval of the professional services agreement and understand the process of districting. In January of 2020, the city received a letter from Kevin Shankman of Shankman & Hughes alleging that the city's current at-large election system violates the California Voting Rights Act, otherwise known as CVRA. The law firm stated that the city's at-large election system, which is where all registered voters vote for every council seat in the city, diluted the ability of Asian Americans to elect candidates of their choice or otherwise influence the outcome of the city's council elections. This letter is similar to the dozens of letters that other cities across the state have received alleging violations of the CVRA. These letters request that the jurisdictions cure the issue by moving to a by-district election, which is when a jurisdiction is split into districts and registered voters vote for the council seat in their district only. So on March 2nd, council met in closed session to consider the various options available to the city. And then on March 16th, council adopted Resolution 32-2020, reflecting its intent to transition from at-large to by-district for council elections. So then later in the year, in August, the city released an RFP to assist with the districting process. We sent out the RFP to various firms that are experts in this field, and it's important to note that this is a very niche field. And so we are lucky that we received a proposal from Redistricting Partners. Paul Mitchell, the head of Redistricting Partners, has assisted several jurisdictions in making the switch, including Los Angeles Unified School District and the city of Santa Ana. So Niall Blackburn, the assistant to the city manager, and myself met with Redistricting Partners over Zoom to discuss their proposal. And at this meeting, the following 3 items were stressed. Due to staffing constraints at the city, we would need assistance with outreach to ensure that the process is as expansive as possible. Therefore, Redistricting Partners suggested a company they have worked with previously, Imprenta, who will be assisting us with our outreach needs. Secondly, to ensure that the districts are drawn without bias, Redistricting Partners is not to know where our council members live. This way, your residence is not taken into consideration when drawing the map. And lastly, we wanted to ensure that even during these times of COVID, that as many members of the public could assist with drawing maps. So Redistricting Partners has a solution for that as well, which they'll be discussing tonight, involving a mapping tool that we'll be able to put on our website for any member of the public that would like to draw their own map. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul Mitchell and his associates to go over the process and to answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much. And can you enable me to share the screen, or do you?
Yeah, I'll make you a do you have the presentation yourself?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just make you a co-host. Okay.
Great. I presume you can see it now?
No. Oh, yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for having me, and that was a great introduction to the issue. So you've been reading up on this niche field. I'm happy to be here with you today. I also have with us Sophia Garcia, who's a new member of our team. She's focusing on outreach, and recently from the Dolores Huerta Foundation came over to Redistricting Partners a month or so ago to help us, and she'll be part of the team that's working with you. So I'm going to go through some basics of the CVRA. There we go. Go through the basics of what the California Voting Rights Act is, the distinction between different terms used, sometimes interchangeably, regarding redistricting, go over some traditional redistricting principles, some of which have been codified into state law in California recently. And there's a couple different code sections I'll talk about with regard to the rules under which you're going to be performing this act. Look a little bit at the population composition of the city of Burlingame and talk about the mapping that will be happening in the city. So first off, the California Voting Rights Act is a state law that forbids the use of at-large election systems in areas where there is racially polarized voting. The 2 terms that are really important in this is what is an at-large election, and that's one where people from the entire agency vote for each of the council members rather than single member districts. Racially polarized voting is a term that honestly means something in California that's different than what it means nationally. Nationally, racially polarized voting has a bunch of different tests as to whether or not it can be considered racially polarized voting for the purposes of determining whether an election system is diluting voting strength. In California, racially polarized voting can easily be described as differences in voting patterns based on different protected classes and their historic votes. The California Voting Rights Act changes some of the use of common terminology and makes it easier for plaintiffs to come forward and require and essentially sue for an agency to convert or make a settlement agreement in order to not sue. And one of the ways in which it makes it easier for these plaintiffs is that it eliminates the idea that you would have nationally that if you're able to draw a majority minority district, then you have to convert to a by-district election system. In California, we've stripped away that requirement for a majority minority district and allow for the creation of districts where there are areas where a protected class could, quote unquote, influence the outcome of an election. The other thing the CVRA does is kind of flips the financial reward for bringing these lawsuits, whereas prior to CVRA, when, as an example, the city of Santa Maria was sued to go to districts, it took years in federal court. It took plaintiffs millions of dollars of spending to try to sue the city, and no guarantee that they were ever going to get their money back. The CVRA has flipped that and automatically rewards the plaintiffs by paying all their legal fees when a city does convert. The only relief that cities and other agencies have received in the last several years is a cap on those damages that can be, the reward that plaintiffs can receive for that. So the districting is the process we're going to be in. It's the process of going from an at-large election system to districts for the first time. Now, the districts will determine who can run for office. The eligibility will be that anybody has to live in one of those districts. It determines who votes in that election. So if you're only having people vote from your district for that representative, and so as a result, in your city elections, you're not necessarily going to have citywide elections where everybody in the city is voting for city council at one time. You're going to have elections in which, you know, one part of the city is voting for council members and the other part has to wait 2 more years to vote for their council members. One thing it doesn't determine is how you must govern. So to be clear, the CVRA enacts these districts. These districts are operative at the time of elections. In fact, when we implement these districts will become operative in a staggered process where some seats will become operative in the next election in 22, and the remainder will become operative in 24. So there's kind of a 2-step process to the full implementation of these boundaries. But it doesn't mean that each of the council members has to treat their district as like their own little fiefdom. They can still govern the city as a whole. And we've seen this in different agencies. We've seen some agencies that maybe even before the creation of districts, they were most focused on certain pockets of the city in terms of where they were from, who they felt they represented in that city. The conversion of districts just exacerbated that. We've seen others that really felt that their city or water board or school board was kind of a larger concern of everyone, and the creation of districts, you know, didn't disrupt that. Another way of putting it is we've seen dysfunctional local governments and very functional local governments in both districted and non-districted systems. And really, it's going to be up to you after this process is done as to how you go forward. One example I like to note is in the city where I live, the city council members, when you go to one of their offices, on their door, it says the neighborhoods in the city they represent. As if that's something, the first thing you see walking into their office is, I care about these neighborhoods. And that's the kind of thing that I would, you know, discourage for an agency that's been existing in an at-large structure that's relatively small and probably wants to maintain that citywide focus for everything. Now, once you're districted, then in future decades, you're going to be doing redistricting, which is the reorganizing of the city district boundaries in order to account for population changes. Within the US, this process is very politicized. In other countries, it might just be like a ministerial job where nobody really even pays attention to it. It just happens. But in the US, it's become very political. The other term people hear when somebody says, when I tell somebody I do redistricting, they kick back like, oh, gerrymandering. Like that's the one thing they know about redistricting is the term of the gerrymander. And the gerrymander was a state Senate plan, and it was done by Governor Gary. So technically it's a gerrymander. It's kind of like the GIF-GIF debate of redistricting. But this is an old-timey thing. Most people don't think of this as being something that's current. But in 2001, the legislature created this state Senate district, which ended up being the state Senate district of Pro Tem Kevin De Leon. And if you look at it, to me, it looks like the original gerrymander. Odd shapes don't mean bad lines, and we can talk about that at some point, but this one in particular was one that was clearly drawn for certain political reasons. And there's been a long history of that even in California, where even if it's largely Democratic area, you still have gerrymandering happening for other, even nonpartisan issues, like what areas people want to represent, or trying to draw districts that are more affluent, trying to draw districts that are, favoring one political group or another. The way gerrymandering works is essentially by taking an area where there's kind of a clear majority of voices in one direction. So this is an area with all these little triangles and there's a majority yellow. And if I gave each of you a pen in 5 seconds and I said, draw 3 districts, a normal person would just draw this, right? And that would be a situation, whether you drew this horizontally or vertically, where you're creating 2 districts where they would be yellow and one would be green. And the natural breakdown of this is that in most elections, obviously the winds of election cycles, but in most elections, you would have a majority of the yellow, which is representative of the overall population. But if I give them 10 seconds and they thought about it a little bit, they might draw this. And now we've gone ahead and we've created the green majority by advantaging one party by drawing lines that split the yellow populations up in a way to dilute their voting strength. And so we've, in this example, gerrymandered the yellow into having less political power. And that is essentially how gerrymandering works. Fortunately, we know how to use certain traditional redistricting principles and have the transparency and openness in our redistricting process to avoid a gerrymander. The rules for redistricting, these are the kind of traditional rules, are that districts need to be relatively equal size. So oftentimes people think, okay, size means area, and it doesn't. What it means is people. So there are 2 different metrics that we use in this idea of equality. There's the kind of one person, one vote idea, and there's the equal representation idea. And these are 2 competing ideas. One person, one vote means that 2 districts, all the voters should have equal voting power. Equal representation means that when somebody has a pothole in their district, that their voice is as equally loud as a neighboring district resident who has a pothole, that it's not some kind of complete imbalance in the representation in each district. And we're using people, not voters or any other subpart of that. We're using the most recent decennial census, and the deviation between the largest district and the smallest district, based on kind of a national norm, is 10%, meaning the largest district is no more than 10% larger than the smallest district. Now, we might get into a discussion in the future where there's a sense that narrower deviations, meaning more close populations, is a net positive, but it will have to be looked at in the context of other criteria. So making a district that is a 0.001% deviation, and to do it, you have to make a weaker Asian district, or you have to draw a district that has a funnier shape. Maybe that isn't the right trade-off. So equal population is going to be competing with other ideas in the redistricting process. It's not just that the winning district should be the one with the smallest equal population. Districts should also be contiguous. They shouldn't hop or jump around. This little graphic shows the idea of something that is non-contiguous, right? There are a couple definitions in here, though. There's literally contiguous, is like from a satellite photo, I can see this area and it's whole. Functionally contiguous is a little bit more of a subtle idea, and that is in 2 ways. One is, if I was drawing Angel Island into a district, I would draw it with San Francisco because it's functionally contiguous to San Francisco. Nobody goes from Angel Island to Santa Cruz. It's not contiguous to Santa Cruz. It's not literally contiguous to anything because of the water, but in function, it's contiguous to San Francisco. The second idea in functionally contiguous is that if I was to draw a district, and let's say I was crossing the 101. If I'm crossing the 101 in a district, it might be functionally one whole thing with the 101 cut down the middle. But if there's no freeway underpass or overpass, and you literally have to go from one side of the district out of the district to a on-ramp onto the 101, get off the 101, get back into the district and do some weird thing to get from one side to the other, then functionally it's not contiguous. It is contiguous literally, but it's in such a way that it really doesn't make sense. At the end here, I have a map that can give an example of that from a recent redistricting we did. Maintaining communities of interest is really one of the core functions of this process. And this is honestly why redistricting can't just be done by a computer. You can't just create an algorithm, because weighing communities of interest really requires kind of a human introspection about what are the communities of interest in the area of the agency. The first kind of community of interest are the protected classes. We might get down this road, but when you have districts that can influence the outcome of an election, or communities that are protected classes that can influence the outcome of an election, or that can be majority minority, then you have to create opportunities for those districts to be drawn. You can't draw districts predominantly on race. So you can't just say, hey, Paul, draw me a district with the most Asian population in it. That wouldn't actually be a legal way to go about it. But if we said there's an Asian population that could influence the outcome of an election under a number of different district scenarios, and this one maintains contiguity, it's compact, it meets all these other criteria, and it also maximizes the voting power of the Asian community in an election, then you can do those versions of lines. It's just there's a little bit of art form in the way that you construct districts so that you're not just going and drawing them predominantly or solely based on race. Another community of interest type is the types of populations that live within the city, and then also in that somewhat how they interact with the city. So you could think of a workforce. You could think of people who commute to the city to come back, home at night as a community of interest. You could think of people who utilize certain city services, senior citizens as an example, or people who, are kind of a known downtown population versus a more suburban population. And it also speaks to the agency. So in the San Mateo Harbor District redistricting, might not surprise you, but the harbors, where they were, was an interest in the redistricting process, and literally fishermen. I don't expect fishermen to be a critical community of interest in this redistricting, but if it was the hospital district where we did the Sequoia Hospital District redistricting, it was the facilities for the healthcare facilities. So each agency has different potential communities of interest as well. Following city county government lines is another kind of principle in the redistricting process. It's actually required in the statewide redistricting and encouraged in local redistricting and state law. And then finally, keeping districts compact. Compact is more about shape than it is about small. There are a bunch of nerdy math calculations about compactness that look at the total distance or circumference of an area versus its ideal shape if you just draw it as a circle, things like that. But in California, we've actually come to a more qualitative description of compactness. And that is that when you're getting from one area to another, you do it without bypassing other nearby populations. So as an example, this blue district in Martinez, I actually am friends with the council member that lives here, so I can make fun of his district. That blue district in Martinez is getting population from way up in the top of Martinez, bypassing thousands and thousands of residents to come down here to the southeastern part of the district to get the other population. That is by state law, not a compact district. It's also mathematically, it would fail the compactness test. In this other agency on the right-hand side, this is the city of Roseville. In the city of Roseville, you have a kind of two lobes district that is drawn on the southeast side as one major population center. It bypasses all this blue to come and all this orange to come all the way over here to get other population. That would be not compact. And in fact, that was done in order, both of these instances are done where they were kind of bending over backwards to draw districts that would keep incumbents in their seats. So that's the kind of thing that the state law would forbid. And in fact, This one on the left went to this, was sued. They went to the court. The judge called it a parody of a gerrymander and then ruled that he couldn't rule against it because under the law, as this plan was implemented, about 6 months before the new law took effect, there was nothing the court could do to invalidate it. But under the 2020 redistricting, they're going to have to change that district. It would not be a valid district, anything close to it. This is another district that I like to point out in terms of compactness, because you can see 4 compact districts up top, and then you see one district at the bottom that probably is not considered necessarily compact. On the right-hand side, it takes a suburban community, this Mace Boulevard area in Davis, and then connects it on the left to more of a downtown area. It does stretch, but the reason I point this out is that the reason this district below here is not compact is because it had to stay contiguous. And splitting this part of the city in Davis is the Capitol Corridor train. And literally almost anywhere in this purple district to get to the green or yellow, there are only 2 roads, Richards and Mace, to get across the city. So in drawing that district, it was important to make sure that we were drawing that district in a way where it was functionally contiguous. So that functional contiguous thing comes up. And as I was talking about before, it's a balance of all these different criteria. So just because we come up with a district and say this one has a weird shape, it might be because it's in order to meet other criteria. So in addition to these traditional redistricting criteria, we also have, starting in 2020, a new law, the Fair Maps Act, that requires transparency in the districting process. There is the CVRA Safe Harbor provisions and the Fair Maps Act, both of which should be followed by the city in this process. This process encourages transparency. It requires that when you have a meeting, that the agenda be posted, any maps to be discussed are posted 7 days ahead of time, a whole bunch of stuff that we're working with you on to ensure that we're meeting those criteria and allowing for the members of the public to have access to an understanding of the districting process. Other criteria in that is that that this agency does not consider incumbent or candidate addresses in the creation of districts. Also, that it does not draw districts to advantage party. In fairness, that's part of the law that a lot of us who do local redistricting kind of like rolled our eyes at, because I've never seen a redistricting for local government that came down to partisanship. I've seen a redistricting in local government that came down to where incumbents lived. I've seen redistricting at the local government level that came down to the urban representative not wanting to have hillsides and the hillside representative not wanting to have those pesky urban people, and a lot of other criteria that come into play. But I don't think we're going to have a problem in this districting of people trying to inject partisanship. So right now, all we have is the 2010 census. The 2020 census has been delayed. As of today, the Census Department said that the appropriation data that was supposed to be out December 31st is now probably not going to come out until February 9th or later. That's pushing back everything in our ability to get the census data. And our expectation is that we're not going to get it until maybe June, maybe July of this year. So until then, all we have is the 2010 census. And in the 2010 data, if you were to have 5 districts, it would be around 5,800 residents. If you'd have 4 districts, it'd be around 7,200 residents. Now that's one data set we're going to talk a lot about. When we're drawing districts for equal population, we're going to use the decennial census. For the record, when we look at the current census estimates, you're at 30,800 residents. So these numbers are going to go up. You've grown, based on the Census American Community Survey, you've grown 7.2%, whereas the state as a whole has grown around 6%. So you're growing faster than the rate of the state's population growth. And you will have to adjust these numbers will adjust when we get that data. The second piece of data, and honestly, this data doesn't adjust as much, is the ethnic population in the agency. Right now, the citizen voting age population, which is what we'll use to determine like an eligible voter calculation, that is 22% Asian, 11% Latino, only 1% Black, and 65% white, other populations. So the operative population in terms of that earlier slide where I was talking about the protected classes, the most operative population in that is probably the Asian population. And we'll look at whether or not districts can be drawn to maximize their voting strength as a community of interest, to allow them to influence the outcome of elections, or even potentially to be a majority minority of one district, although at 22%, that's probably pretty unlikely. Now, when we look at the city, and as we go through this districting process, we're going to be looking at other things as well as communities of interest, maybe neighborhoods, other criteria. But one of the most important things we're going to do to determine communities of interest is to get public feedback. And there's two ways we're going to do that. One is we're going to work with your staff to get on the website and have available at each of the public hearings a simple community of interest worksheet. This will be like a PDF that somebody can fill out and turn in. They would ask them, what is their community of interest? Where does it physically exist? What makes that community cohesive? How does it interact with the city? So that is going to be a key part of this process. The other part of the process is going to be looking at actual mapping tools to allow the residents to either draw, my community of interest is this is my downtown neighborhood, this is my neighborhood where I've lived or my family's lived for 20 years or 50 years or whatever, or to actually draw examples of districts that they would like to see. We'll work with your staff to get that implemented and up, and we'll have some trainings on it. And in fact, I can send to you or have sent to you tonight to your city staff an example of me going through like a 15-20 minute video of how that mapping tool works. It might be 30 minutes, but we can get it to you so that you can take a look at that. The time frame we're looking at, and then this is my last slide and we can go into any questions, is 2 public hearings that are purely about outreach. No pen to paper, no map drawing. It's just about allowing the public an opportunity to communicate to us what their community of interest is, what their concerns about are in the districting process, and for you guys to communicate to me what you would like to see in potential draft lines when we do get to the line drawing process. And then we're going to have to wait a little bit. We can do some, maybe like an outreach meeting, we can have the online tool up, but we're going to have to wait until the data is released to come out with draft maps. Once we have those draft maps, we can schedule another hearing. The draft maps would have to be up for 7 days for public viewing prior to our meeting, but we can hold the 3rd and 4th meetings where their purpose is to get public feedback on the maps that have been drawn, solicit any additional community of interest testimony, allow you as the council to have feedback on those maps and suggest changes, and prepare for what will be a 5th hearing. That 5th hearing is going to be an up or down vote by the council to adopt a single plan that's been selected with no significant changes at that time or afterwards. I use the word significant changes because we might find ourselves having passed a plan and then the San Mateo County Registrar's Office contacts me or contacts the staff and says, hey, this one parcel looks like it's on this side of the census block or that side of the census block. Can you clarify for that for us? And we might make small adjustments because the County of San Mateo uses parcels for its precincts, while we in the redistricting world use census geography for our precinct, for our drawing. So whenever working in San Mateo County in particular, we have a kind of a post-redistricting meeting with the county to convert the data from these squiggly, weird census block boundaries to the parcel layers. In some counties, they've done a parcel project with the state, with the federal government to provide to the US Census Department every one of their parcel lines in order to align parcels to census blocks. But it's my understanding that San Mateo County does not participate in that. So we have to do this kind of post redistricting work with the county. And I believe some of your staff has experience with the County Registrar's Office in that regard as well. So that'll be helpful. And with that, I'm happy to release my screen and answer any questions or come back to any of these slides that are ones people want to talk about some more.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. And thank you to our city clerk for both your presentations. So we'll actually start off with questions from my colleagues. And I actually wanted to start off with just a couple questions. So one is in regard to the mapping. So we wait until the census data is released, which we're not sure when that will be. So what's the time period between the release of the census data and then the map being presented?
So the time frame would be that you'll probably see in the newspaper census released. And we'll contact your staff and work with them on the specific time frame, what we're expecting. But there are a couple steps we are going to have to go through before we actually draw a draft plan. The first is that under California state law, this time for the first time in the state's history, we're going to have to do a reallocation of prisoner population. That shouldn't have a big impact in Burlingame because you do not, as far as I know, have a federal penitentiary or some kind of, you don't have a facility in your city. However, the statewide process is going to be done to take any areas that have prisoners and move them out of that area for the purposes of redistricting and reallocate them back to wherever they were living prior to being arrested. So we might see some census blocks that grow a little bit because you're having former residents being moved back in simply for the purposes of drawing lines. Should have very negligible impact on you, but just that is one step that'll be happening, and it might take 3 weeks or so for that to happen. Once that's done, we should be able to turn around draft maps for you almost immediately. We generally would do about 3 maps based on the feedback from the city council, which would be informed by the community of interest testimony that's been provided so far. So you're going to have 2 hearings where you're going to have a lot of members of the public potentially either coming forward and talking about their communities of interest or people online submitting their testimony or maps. Those will go and be informative of the potential draft lines we create at that first iteration. We would release those to your city staff. They would be able to put those up on the website. And as soon as they're up on the website, you could have a hearing anytime after 7 days. From there, you could have your 4th hearing really on your own time frame. It could be 2 weeks after or something like that, or it could be a month after. It probably wouldn't be exactly 1 week after because you again have that 7-day requirement for posting maps. So if you were to make any changes and post those, say the next day, that would mean that you'd have to wait 7 days to have the next hearing.
Okay, thank you. And then my final question is, considering we are in the COVID-19 pandemic and we may not be meeting in person, and a lot of this would be, I assume, online, what can be done then for people who may not be tech savvy or they may not have a computer to make sure that they are able to participate?
Yeah. I think it's an excellent question and something that I think everybody's going to be struggling with. The state redistricting commission struggling with it right now. We're doing the redistricting in Long Beach right now with the commission, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to kind of inform that process with great community input without having a lot of the normal tools we would use, which would be in-person meetings. In the redistricting consultant world, there's kind of 2 camps. There's the camp of redistricting consultants that we're all mathy, computery kind of people. And so we all want people to do maps online. And that's the thing that we always promote. And then there's others that are more community-based. Like we want to do the outreach meeting at the community center. We want to see people working with family members to draw maps by hand. We want to take some of the technical stuff out of the process. And we at Redistricting Partners are in that second camp. We really do not prefer using online mapping tools. And we haven't traditionally encouraged that in our prior redistrictings. However, with COVID, it is becoming the really de facto way for you to get informed community input through the process. There are a few things we can do to kind of deal with that concern about individual members of the community not having the tech savvy. I can think of my own mom maybe not wanting to get online and draw a map on a computer. It's not really her forte. The first is we have that community of interest outreach worksheet where people can describe their area. and email it in. In fact, if somebody were to take a cell phone picture of a map they drew on a napkin and email that in, we would work with your staff to convert that to a electronic submission. The second thing is doing outreach to each of the community-based organizations. As I mentioned, Sophia's watching here, and she'll be available working with your staff. She comes from the Dolores Huerta Foundation, where they did a lot of work going out into the community to get input. In her time doing this work, it wasn't always COVID. It was oftentimes just members of the community where she was working that didn't feel comfortable going to a government building to go testify at a hearing. And so that same barrier existed even pre-COVID of how are you going to get input from these communities that are important, but might not be, willing to or interested in going to a city council meeting where they have to sit around for 4 hours and listen to people talk before they get a chance to testify. And so working with those community-based organizations is probably a key way to cut through to get really good informed testimony from the community and to work with those groups. And that's one of the things that we've provided in working with Imprenta Communications, the firm that is acting as a subcontractor and working with your staff. They're working together already, going through lists of local contacts, media sources, ways to get this information to the public and to lean on those existing structures within the city that exist for all other kinds of issues, recently for the California Count census work. So leaning on those CBOs and people involved in that, and then also leaning on those communication networks, that's really a way to cut into, kind of cut through a lot of this technology stuff and get to the community to get good input.
Great, thank you very much.
Mayor O'Brien, I'd just like to add that we've also discussed using our very successful library curbside pickup as a way to get in contact with people, and also our farmers market as another avenue to get out information in person to people that don't want to use the mapping tools online.
Excellent, thank you very much. I am going to call on my colleagues. If you have any questions, we have Councilmember Beach.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Mitchell, for a great presentation and all the pre-work that staff did with you to get us here. So we appreciate it. Very informative. Love hearing the community outreach, whether it's the community-based organizations or the worksheets, the mapping tools, the meetings, all that sounds great. Can you tell us a little bit more about your plan or your capacity to do foreign language outreach, particularly, Chinese languages and Spanish, and how do we approach that?
Yeah, and that's again why we brought in Imprenta. And we can get some information from the city staff as to the contract that's being worked with them. But they do have experts in not just like translation services, but also outreach in language, whether it's through working with local media, emails, other communication, even direct mail to those communities in language. So it's not I can't give you the right answer, I guess, with the complete information, but it's one that is being addressed because your city staff really emphasized that, not both when they put their proposal together that we responded to, but also in every meeting that we've had, they've emphasized that. So that's why they're coming.
Great. And there'll be translation services and such, even going the extra mile at those meetings and everything. That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Councilmember Coulson.
Thank you. I have just one comment and two questions. So my comment is that for our consultant, we have been doing some meetings with the community regarding our plaza, our town square, and also our North Rollins Road area. And one of the things that we found is the chat feature in a Zoom call has been prolific in comments, and probably people would be commenting more there than they might in a regular meeting where they'd be called on and given a minute or two. And the dialogue we found to be incredibly helpful and very authentic and really diverse. Is that going to be captured in that community outreach if we're doing this all on Zoom?
So we actually have the benefit of we're one of the few firms that has actually done a redistricting in the COVID era. Our Napa redistricting was done where we did our final outreach hearing right at the beginning of or end of February. And I think by March, we were having our meetings online, and we're doing a few different things. One was receiving just emails from the public during the meeting that the city clerk was reading. Other things were getting information like in a chat function. And I think that that's an excellent way to get, like you're saying, really authentic feedback. And in some ways, this COVID era transition of all of us to doing things virtually is providing easier access to a lot of members of the community for meaningful input. I think most of us focused on the negatives. I mean, we all could focus on negatives all day long, but the negatives in the outreach process of not being able to have those in-person meetings at a senior center. But on the flip side, a lot of council meetings, trying to tell somebody that they have to show up at a certain place and sit and wait for hours to go and testify for 2 minutes on a redistricting thing, that can be a barrier too. And if somebody in a community group can email out or send out a text message to the people in the organization and say, go on the Zoom right now and leave a chat that says this, that kind of community engagement can be valuable. And there is almost a lower bar to engaging in this virtual environment. So there are some positives, like you said. And I think what we would want to do is at the end of every Zoom to make sure that that chat is saved and that that chat is a form of the actual public testimony. And just so you know how we work with this input is if I'm presenting lines that are drawn, maybe it's going to be 6 months from now, we don't know. I might say, well, this line was drawn. And as we recall, there was a community of interest discussion from the chat that said this. And then there was Bob and Sally's map that said that, and draw every line in the redistricting plan and every shape that's done should be something that we can point back to some community testimony or some testimony from the council members as to why it's being drawn like that. And so it's all very important.
That's really helpful. Secondly, and this is probably just an obvious question, but I want to make sure I understand this. So they first are looking through the ethnic community. If they cannot find a cohesive boundary to create a majority or other kind of ethnic type district, do they just move into, do you just move into the secondary criteria, sort of the communities of interest then?
Yeah, no, it's an important question. And it's one that's almost kind of a subtle distinction between different ways in which criteria are used. Drawing districts based on the racial composition is kind of there's a binary test. Okay, first is, I can't be told, go draw a district to make the most African-American or Latino district. That can't be the charge. The charge has to be to draw districts that meet all these criteria. But if I tell you, based on the data, that there's a possibility of creating a majority minority district, and I provide to you, or the city passes a final redistricting plan that does not create a majority minority district, even though we know that there is one out there to be drawn, or maybe somebody came from the community and provided one, then you could be in violation of the Federal Voting Rights Act by not drawing the possible or hypothetical district that could be created based on compactness, equal population, these other things. So there is this binary thing of like, either you are or you aren't in a situation where you're required to draw a federally required 50% majority minority district. Secondarily, if we don't fall into that binary test, then we could say, well, there still is this California Voting Rights Act, which is a civil rights act. That's the reason we're here. There is a population that has a claim that their voting power has been diluted in the at-large election system. So we need to make sure that if there's an opportunity to draw a district where we can allow for that community to influence the outcome of an election, then we should draw it. And we need to do it within the context of all the other requirements, but we'd be in a position where it would be really, it'd be wrong for us to come out with a plan that took that minority population and split it into 5 different districts or 4 different districts in a way that continued the dilution of their voting strength. If that were the case, then attorneys that brought the original claim would have every right to come back and say, hey, we brought this case to you because you were diluting the voting power of this minority community in your at-large system. So you just went and created a districting system that did the same thing. So we're not going to draw a plan that's going to perpetuate that. We're going to draw a plan that's going to solve for that. At the same time, there's going to be other types of communities of interest, a downtown community of interest. There's going to be geographic elements. There's going to be a freeway cutting through the middle of the city. There's going to be any other governmental boundary. So there's going to be a lot of other things we take into consideration. But you're right. If we find ourselves dealing with that issue or find ourselves unable to draw a district that really maximizes their voting power as a protected class, then we will fall to other criteria.
And then lastly, so right now we run on a 3-2. So 3 council members run, then 2. So I assume in the districting election, you have the same. There's going to be 3 districts that are going to run. And then on the next 2-year cycle, there'll be two districts that'll be open. So when you have, and I say this actually interestingly enough, not from the perspective of a council person, but from the perspective of a potential resident or community member that might want to run for election. Obviously, people are going to be disappointed because there's going to be people who think they're going to run in 2022, but their district may not be one of the ones districted. How do you also handle the incumbencies? So if you redistrict and say 4 of us live in, so 4 people live in one, and they're obviously on different terms, how do you handle that? I just don't understand the mechanics behind it.
Yeah. So help me here. How many seats do you have open or running for election in 22?
The 22 will be a 3.
Okay.
And then the 2s will run in 24.
Yeah. So first off, you have to think about the implementation of the districted system as a 2-step process. So in 22, you're going to elect 3 members from districted areas.
Mm-hmm.
You're still going to have 2 members that were elected in the at-large election system. So you're going to have 2 are serving at-large and 3 in districted seats. Those 2 that are elected at-large, they could live anywhere in the city. They could live in one of the same districts that one of the other people do or whatever. Then in 24, those other 2 geographic areas are going to come up for election. So then after 24, all 5 council members, if you're doing a 5-member system, would have their seats in those districted systems. Now, when we come out with plans, we'll probably come out and kind of be a little bit non-committal on it, and we'll probably give you letters for each district. So we'll say you have A, B, C, D, and E. And that's in part because the numbering of the districts and when they come up for election is a part of the map drawing process. And it's actually something that gets done at the final hearing. At that final hearing, the law states that you have to have a 7-day mapping period where a map and a numbering system have been made public. At that last hearing, you cannot make changes to the map, but you can make changes to the numbering order of elections of what's going to come up when. So we at Redistricting Partners are not going to know which incumbents are in which districts, but we will give you a numbering system, and we might have your staff provide for you a little matrix that says, in this numbering system, districts 1, 2, and 3 would be up in 22, and 4 and 5 would be up in 24. And this has 1 vacancy, this one has 2 members in the same district or whatever. You can do something to kind of incorporate that into your decision-making about the numbering process. Ultimately, there will be a decision point potentially where if you have 2 members in the same district and their election is at the same time, you might want to number that and order it in a way so that they both have the election at the same time. They can decide if they're going to run against each other or only one person's going to run. If 2 people are in a district and they have a different election order, then in a way, when you say that district's going to be up in 24, somebody who's termed out in 22 doesn't have something to run for 2 more years. So they would be off the council. If you number it so that it's up in 22, then the person who's up for election in 22 can run for it. And the person whose seat would be normally up in 24 can run for that district election system, then vacate their at-large seat after they get elected. So you have this ability to deal with it, and it's something that is probably the most political part of the districting process. And we can do all the openness and transparency and draw districts not knowing where the incumbents live. But at that last hearing, it's, naive to say that you as the council members aren't going to understand the political consequences of what plan you determine to take on and what numbering system you choose, which will decide what years different seats come up on for election.
Okay, that's helpful to understand. So you could run, so say there were two people in one district, one was a 2022 and one was a 2024. The 24 could run essentially from a safe seat against the 22.
Yeah.
And
So
they
I would.
They just go from 28.
So this is where kind of
right?
as a practice, I always lean on the city attorney, and I do see on the Zoom a city attorney there, maybe not wanting to get called on right now, but I lean on the city attorney to answer the question as to what would happen if somebody were to want to run for a seat, whether or not they would have to vacate their at-large seat to run for the seat, or what would happen if they won vacating an at-large seat, how the council would replace them. So if I could punt that to the city attorney, and maybe either now or in the future, he can get back to you on that.
It's complicated. And I know there's other people with questions, so I don't think we have to answer it tonight, but I think it's definitely something that has to be explained in the process, unless my colleagues are interested in hearing.
And I'll absolutely look into it and get back to you on a later time. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Coulson. We can have Councilmember Brownrigg, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'll be quick. I know we're discouraged from editorializing, but I just can't help remarking that I think a great number of Burlingame residents are going to be sorry not to be able to have a say in all 5 of their representatives. I think a lot of people are going to be very surprised to hear they only get to have their voice heard once every 4 years, and they only get to vote for somebody who lives down the street. But that's my editorial comment. I have a couple of quick questions. One, we have been effectively sued or threatened to be sued because we have diluted the Asian vote and therefore not permitted Asian representation or Asian influence in the elections. If we can't develop a plan that maximizes Asian influence, then why do we continue with districts at all?
That's an excellent question. It's one that comes up a lot. And the fact is that the law is not outcome based. The law is essentially saying that if you have racially polarized voting, that you're not allowed to have the kind of traditional at-large election system. I have seen instances where the conversion to districts could arguably make a population less effective at electing a candidate of choice. Those are kind of rare. They might not be as common now that we're moving prison population out of districts, but I did have one where the most Latino portion of the city actually was where there was a prison population, and therefore it was creating a district which would not elect a Latino, but what it did do was deprive other Latino populations in the city from having the voting power citywide. It was a kind of a fluky situation. But under the Federal Voting Rights Act, you would actually have a way of showing potentially that you essentially don't have a remedy associated with the transition to district systems. And so under federal law, you would not have to convert to districts because there's no remedy. But that is not existing in state law. In state law, it's, do you have a racially polarized voting system? If so, you need to convert to districts. There are a couple lawsuits that are still outstanding. One more locally to you is in Santa Clara, where I think they just lost a lawsuit maybe 2 days ago, trying to claim that they didn't need to convert to districts. Another one is in Santa Monica, where the same court that years ago said Santa Clarita had to convert to districts now told Santa Monica they don't have to convert to districts, but it's now being appealed. And your attorney could explain this part better than I could, but the court, when it made that decision, actually said that this ruling doesn't have precedent, that it was entered without that kind of ability to influence other court cases around the state. So there is some fluctuation potentially in the law in the coming years based on court cases, but right now we're still working under the kind of construct we've worked under for the last 10 years or so, which says that it's the fact of having racially polarized voting, not the fact of having a remedy, that results in the requirement to convert to districts.
So I think that's bad government policy. If you can't remedy something, you shouldn't just go messing with it for the fun of it. But my other question is that it is altogether possible, in some cases likely, that two of our neighborhoods are going to get much larger. So one is there, we have decided as part of our effort to create more affordable housing to create a whole new neighborhood, so a formerly industrial district. But there won't be any residents I don't think, by the time we make this plan. So how does a plan future-proof for areas that don't have housing but are going to have housing? And a similar question is, although this will probably take longer, the county has asked us to consider taking on unincorporated county lands that abut Burlingame, and that would also be a significant increase in population. So how do we take account of those two rather significant population changes?
Yeah, so another good question that comes up a lot. The fact is that the data set we'll use to determine equal population is April 1st, 2020. So it will not future-proof for new developments. That's an imperfect part of the way districting works, but it looks at the most recent decennial census for that district size. There are the facts, like you mentioned, where you put in a new development and to the obvious kind of any natural observer would say, well, look, there's all that new population. I did have an interesting story from the city of Davis where they had this new development called the Cannery in northern Davis. And everybody said, well, that district needs to be adjusted because you have that obvious new population right there, where in the 2010 census, it was like a field. The problem was that when we actually looked at the data, those districts up there in that part of Davis actually were underpopulated because there was a bunch of growth in South Davis of people putting more people into individual apartments in internal growth within the existing housing structure, that the population growth in South Davis was kind of something the council didn't recognize or notice. If they had been able to future-proof their redistricting, they would have actually erred in the side of giving more political power to areas that have affluent new homes, not necessarily the case you're talking about, and weakening the political power of places that have grown more organically and were actually increasing in size faster than the rate of the overall city. So you can't really draw districts to future-proof in that way. You do have that 10% buffer. So no district can be 10% larger than the biggest district and the smallest district. The difference can't be more than 10%. So you could move that buffer a little bit. So you essentially underpopulate the districts that you know are getting new population and overpopulate the ones that you think are going to be more stagnant in their future population. But there's two caveats with that. One is when we do that, we might find we're just talking about like a couple hundred people, not big changes. The second thing is that when you do this, you're going to want to do that within the context of all the other criteria. So if somebody says, hey, this version of the plan is more future-proof, but it's 2% less Asian in District A, you might say, well, that's not the trade-off we want. So we can look at doing that within that margin of error and that 10% deviation, but probably not at the expense of other criteria that you in the process might think are more important. Even creating districts that have more natural boundaries might be more important than future-proofing a district when all you can do is like adjust it's 300 people less than that one's 300 people more, something like that.
All right, thank you.
The thing is that, and we can have your city attorney come back in the future and I can work with them on this. There is language in the law that allows for you to undergo a new redistricting or to annex population to an adjacent district when you annex population to the city itself. I want to say it's like a 5% of the population, but we can work with your city attorney to get you the exact language. So if you did annex a large amount of population, you might get the pleasure of bringing us back in to redraw your lines, or you might be able to just distribute that population to adjacent districts, as long as it doesn't completely tilt the equal population in the districts.
It does seem like an evergreen assignment for you guys. I commend you. Finally, just since I have the microphone, it's more of a comment. In the timeline that you laid out a couple of public outreach and then a TBD on following meetings. My own experience, and I'm sure you have a lot of experiences, the closer we can put those public outreach to actually seeing a map, the more likely we are to sustain interest. So personally, I wouldn't rush the first public meeting if we're 6 months away from having maps. That's just my own 2 cents. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Brownrigg. So all my colleagues have asked their questions through the city clerk. Do we have anyone from the public that has questions?
We do. I got a Zoom chat from Ray Larios. He asked if Paul could clarify parcels versus census tracts. And also he asked, does redistricting partners factor in hard to count census tracts?
So this is one of my fun, nerdy questions. So the census has a geographic set of layers that it utilizes when it's counting people. The smallest unit of geography is the census block. And in a lot of cases, that's literally just a block. Census block groups are sets of census blocks, and they might average, 1,500 people in each of them. And then census tracts are even bigger, and those are groups of census block groups. So that's a different geographies from the census, and they are created by the Census Department that has the job of drawing these, geographies all around the state. So when we get that file from the census, it tells us how many people are in each weird shape. Now, parcels are literally the lot lines for each of the properties within the county. And those are very, squares and rectangles and not a lot of squiggly lines and weird shapes. The census boundaries oftentimes will follow directly along parcels because it's a road, it's a river, it's some kind of physical geography that is kind of common between both data sets. But then sometimes a census line will go and a parcel will come up like a rectangle, go just past the census line and come back down. And you might have a situation where literally like somebody's front lawn is in another census block. When we come up to those situations, we have to do a little bit of looking where we zoom in physically and look at the map where the census boundary is and where the parcel is. And we bring in like a Google Earth to say, okay, the residences on this street are all in these parcels and all the residences on the other end of the line are in that other district. So when we're splitting it, we'll literally look at like a Google Maps instance to identify which parcels go into which district in the districting process. So it's a situation of two different ways of doing the GIS that we have to deal with. Now, the hard to count language, HTC, the hard to count index for the state is something that we've worked on. And that essentially is areas that have a lot of the demographic, socioeconomic characteristics of areas that are traditionally lower performing in the census. And that those HTC count areas have been used to identify areas for additional outreach in the census. And we do have experience doing redistricting in areas where there is known undercount, sometimes very dramatic known undercount. I think the most dramatic situation we've encountered was the city of Santa Ana that had a very dramatic undercount in the 2010 census. And yet we were having to draw lines based on some areas we knew that actually had more people than the census said, but we still had to draw lines based on that 2010 census data set. So unfortunately, we're not able to adjust for known or kind of expected or even commonly understood undercounts. We just have to draw based on what the census gives us in their decennial redistricting file.
Megan, do we have any more?
I don't have any emails or other Zoom chats, and I don't see any hands up.
Okay, so on that note, I would like to thank Mr. Mitchell for your informative presentation and answering all our questions. We will be meeting with you frequently, futuristically with our community, and we will see how that timeline works out, since there may be a delay in the census information.
Yeah, we'll work with you and your city staff. I want to say they've been extraordinary. We've done some meetings with them and they've been great to work with. So you're lucky with that.
Great, thank you very much. All right, so on that note, then I would need someone to make a motion then to adopt the resolution authorizing the city manager to enter into an agreement. So do I have someone that can make a motion, please?
Madam Mayor, I make the motion to enter the agreement.
Second?
So motion made by Councilmember Beach, seconded by Councilmember Coulson. Megan, can we have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Beach,
Yes.
Councilmember Coulson,
Yes.
Councilmember Brownrigg,
Yes.
Mayor O'Brien.
Yes, so motion passes on a 4-0-1 vote. Thank you. All right, on to item number 10B. We will be receiving an update on the Soft Story Buildings Ad Hoc Committee. And I think we have our Community Development Director, Kevin Gardner.
Thank you, Mayor O'Brien and members of the council. And if I could ask the city clerk to please pull up the presentation. Thank you. And with me also this evening is Chief Building Official Rick Caro, who will be available for questions as well. So I've just put together a few slides to go over the Soft Story Buildings Ad Hoc Committee, both to familiarize the council and the members of the community and let you know what we'll be working on in this next year. Next, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. And we have a couple of objectives with this discussion. The first is an overview of the project and what are soft story buildings. And then we would like to receive input in particular on the ad hoc committee formation, since that's the first thing we're doing right now, but also on the work plan and suggestions that council members may have for things that they would like to see out of this study. Next, please. So first, what is a soft story building? People may be very familiar with this, but for those who are not, they are characterized, they're typically multi-story buildings, and the first floor, or the ground floor, is typically an open, the openings are much larger than the rest of the building. They're usually either carports, garage doors. There's an absence of walls and supports, so it's really just an open space with a building on top. Normally, or most typically, we do see them as residential buildings and in particular multi-unit, multi-family residential buildings. But next slide, please. There are also examples of commercial soft story buildings. So for example, the building on the left has an underground garage, which would be characterized as soft story. The building on the right is mixed use, and storefronts can, depending on how they're situated, could also be characterized as soft stories, in that you have something more dense residential units on top and something more open below. Next, please. So here's a diagram that just kind of shows why this is important, why these buildings are dangerous and vulnerable. As you can see in this diagram, there's a big open structure on the ground. Here it's a carport, just a few supports. These are columns, kind of spindly columns, and then above are residential units with lots of walls and hallways and ceilings and lots of more substantial structural pieces. So it really becomes a top-heavy building. And then if we think of how earthquakes work, the motion is typically lateral. So side by side, the ground moves from side to side. And if you imagine something that's very top-heavy with these little spindly columns, it starts wobbling around. And in the next slide, please. You can have the structural failure where all it takes is one or two columns to collapse and then the whole building slides. And if you go onto Google and you Google soft story buildings, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of scarier photos than this. This is a diagram, but if you can imagine just this, you would not want to be on that ground floor when the building collapses. And in fact, you wouldn't want to be on the upper floors either, because that's a big drop. So it is a significant risk to public safety, to safety and people's lives. It's also representative. It's a big risk to the asset as a piece of property, and we're hearing that some lenders are now starting to require that these buildings be retrofitted before they lend against them, because of exactly this. Once the building collapses, it's not as valuable as a real estate asset either. Next, please. So how do these structural retrofits occur? This is the same building now shown with some fairly simple steel frame supports. And what those do is they beef up those openings between those columns so that there's less of that sideways motion. And in this diagram, in fact, they've missed the sides. You need to get all around the building, so because the earth can move right or left or back and forth. So you would want to do something on those sides, whether it's more steel frames. Shear walls is another example where it's just a very solid wall that acts as a solid piece and can stabilize the building. Or also you'll sometimes see X braces, which is pieces of steel that are arranged in an X so that they control that sideways motion. Next, please. So in Burlingame, we updated our general plan in 2019, and that included a community safety element. One of the goals of that community safety element was to protect people and buildings in Burlingame by reducing the risks associated with geologic and seismic hazards. Next, please. And one of the policies addressed soft story buildings, among some other considerations, is a multi-part policy that first talks about if there's a substantial improvement or expansion of a building, that it be brought up to current codes, which include the seismic codes. But down further into the policy is an encouragement of owners to take steps to remedy the problem by retrofitting buildings to meet current standards. That can include soft story buildings, unbolted foundations, shear walls, and et cetera. Next slide. And the last part of that policy was to then form an ad hoc committee to investigate and describe the seismic risk posed by these pre-1980 is the year that we look at. Sometimes you hear 1978 as well, but it's generally 1980 is the cutoff where the codes did change and became better for seismic. So it's these older buildings pre-1980. And in particular, the ad hoc committee is to look at evaluating the costs and benefits of potential actions. Next, please. So for the work plan, we have it. This is just a very general outline, but the first part is to review an inventory of potential soft story buildings. The staff report mentioned an inventory that was prepared by our structural consultants, Bureau Veritas, who do a lot of work in Burlingame and do our structural calculations, so they know the city well. We did not include the list of potential buildings with the staff report. We're very sensitive to it because these are basically, the way the survey was done was a qualified structural engineer did a visual assessment of buildings to identify likely candidates, but we don't want that to be confused with it being a definitive list. This is more, perhaps it's considered more of an outreach list. These are the buildings we would want to check into to determine, are they indeed soft story buildings, or perhaps they've had some structural retrofits that are not immediately evident just by looking from the street. What a lot of cities have done is they've taken a list of potential buildings like this and used that as an outreach and sent what are called screening forms, and then the property owner can provide information on what improvements may be there that that could or couldn't determine whether the building is considered a soft story. So we will review that list and the study with the ad hoc committee, but we just want to be sensitive to putting a bunch of addresses out there when it's really meant to be a candidate list. The next is to look at ordinances and programs from other municipalities. A number of municipalities have already adopted ordinances for soft stories. So rather than reinventing the wheel, we can learn from our peers. And then also consider options for both incentives and requirements. I think if you look at that general plan policy, it mentions encourage. So we're hoping we can find some incentives that can really encourage property owners to do these retrofits. But we can also look at a range of regulations if it seems some cities do tiers where the most seriously dangerous buildings are in a different tier than ones that are more kind of advisory to have retrofits. And then last but not least would be for the ad hoc committee to report its findings to the city council. Next, please. These are some of the ordinances we've been looking at in the Bay Area. This is pretty much the total: Alameda, Berkeley, Fremont, Hayward, Oakland, and San Francisco. Alameda was actually one of the first, and I know our city manager was there, so she can speak to that. We also included a few Southern California examples in that these are ordinances from cities that have some physical characteristics similar to Burlingame, and we feel we could learn from both their ordinances as well as the programs that they may have developed. Next, please. And then what we really want to get feedback on tonight in particular is the composition of the ad hoc committee. And what we want this to be is a very representative across the broad spectrum of interests. So we do have engineers and structural specialists and people that are really familiar with this topic. But we also want representation of property owners, the California Apartment Associations, SAMCAR. We have a couple planning commissioners who have volunteered. We've asked the American Institute of Architects if they have anyone local. Our DBID representatives. So what we really want is who would be interested in this topic. They should have a place at the table. Admittedly, it is a big table with this list, but we do want people involved, and what we want is those recommendations to really fit Burlingame in particular, and in terms of the types of properties we have here and the kind of profiles of the property owners that we have as well. Next, please. We do have a few that we have not been able to identify individuals for. So the staff report does have names in it. We are still looking for a building contractor, apartment building owner, residential realtor of multi-unit buildings, and a representative from the banking and financing industry. So any suggestions either in this meeting or afterwards as we put this committee together. And I do want to also give a shout out to the Burlingame Neighborhood Network, who did help us with forming the framework of this committee and making some suggestions themselves and doing a certain amount of the outreach, which we're very grateful. And the good news is pretty much everybody we have invited has quite enthusiastically agreed to be in this committee. And we just have a few that we're still kind of scratching our heads trying to figure out who would be the right person. So next slide, please. So the next steps in terms of the committee's work, first, we do want to finalize the ad hoc committee and fill in those extra gaps. If there's an interest that we have not included, we want to include them. This is really meant to be a comprehensive committee. And then we anticipate our first meeting in late January or early February, depending on how we schedule it with the individuals. We expect 3 to 4 ad hoc committee meetings as we make our way through the work program, and then a report to the city council later in 2021, perhaps after the summer break. So with that, as I mentioned, Chief Building Official Rick Haro is also here for questions and the things that we're really looking for feedback, in addition to just familiarizing the council and the community with this project, is input on the formation of the ad hoc committee And then are there particular things you as the council would want to see in the work plan and recommendations that come back to you from this committee? That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Gardner. I will ask my colleagues to, if you have any questions, raise your hand, please. Okay, Council Member Brownrigg.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I appreciate the work done to date. Does the inventory of potential soft story buildings, is that a public document?
We have not published it. It is a public document and that it is something that's in our possession. So it will be shared with the ad hoc committee. And as I mentioned, the reason we haven't really promoted it as a published document is, you know, as soon as you put a list out there, people say, oh, those are the soft stories. So there's a certain nuance to it that we're sensitive to, and particularly if a property owner has their property on there, we want to talk to them first. But that said, yeah, if a member of the public wants to see the report, it is a public document and we can share that.
And by creating this inventory, which I know started with the best of intentions, have we created additional liability for the building owners?
I don't believe so, because the inventory is considered preliminary. So what it does is it basically, from a trained eye, looks at the characteristics of the building and says, based on the characteristics of this building, it could possibly be a soft story construction. It may turn out that they've had all kinds of shear walls put inside and that's not the case. And that's what we would need to verify. I don't think there's any additional liability that wouldn't have already been there just by the characteristics of the building. As you know, one person we spoke to in the outreach had mentioned that in doing these real estate transactions, some of the lenders are already starting to look at the buildings and making these determinations. So the building is what it is, whether it's on a list or not. It's still, if it's got a bunch of stories and a big open ground floor, it's
right. They're not hard to see. Right. They're not hard to see. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Councilmember Coulson.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Kevin, for the report. Director Gardner, I really appreciate it. And if you lived in California in 1989, that I know a lot of us did with the Loma Prieta, it's a big deal to get these buildings fixed up and shored up. And so with that in mind, what I'm really trying to understand is what is the deliverable on this? So we're going to do an inventory. We're going to get, you know, something. But what's the concrete objective? Is it that we will then create a, you know, we'll actually create a program or something that will help people be able to transition and shore these buildings up? Because I hate to do all this work, report, and then it just gets filed on a shelf. And it's like, oh, okay, well, we identified all these, but, you know, we need an active solution if we're going to do this to get and help these property owners make these buildings safe. And so is that included in all this, Kevin, or is that like part B?
I think that is something in particular the ad hoc committee we want them to work on, is what do we do with this information? It's not meant to, certainly it's useful information to the building owners, but I think the intent from the public safety perspective is to map out a plan or a way, an approach that over time these buildings could be retrofitted. There's a kind of a combination of carrots and sticks that the different cities have used, and in some cases they've created public financing mechanisms in order to find a way for property owners to be able to make these improvements. Or if we look at, for example, the, you know, as an earlier reference, the unreinforced masonry buildings as an example, there's a certain timeline and phasing in where over time those buildings do need to be, are required to be retrofitted. I think we're sensitive to, you know, the circumstances of property owners that we'll be kind of balancing between those carrots and sticks. But I think the intention is to map out a plan where those that are interested in doing a retrofit can find a path forward, and then some of the buildings that really need the most attention are maybe prioritized. But that is something we want our subcommittee to really, I'd see them helping us develop a program that meets the needs and circumstances of Burlingame as probably their primary charge.
Okay, great. So then if we do this and we get an action plan, then I assume annually we'll have monitoring on it, like 10 people took advantage of this or that, and there'll be some sort of follow-up probably along the way.
That's right. And you know, different cities have done it in different ways. Some of them do set dates in the future and say, you know, buildings under a certain tier need to be retrofitted by a certain date. That's probably that's the more stick approach. But in terms of, and then, you know, you can report how many buildings fall into each tier and kind of how that works. If it's a more encouragement or carrot approach, then that would be the kind of thing that would be reported as, you know, for example, you know, 5 buildings this year underwent retrofits, and these are the things they did in order to get there.
Would this be the type of program that, say, for example, we had an apartment building, 6 units on El Camino. You can imagine there's lots of them. We see them. And the property owner, the home provider verified, you know, these are the rents. They're, you know, probably maybe they're on the more affordable side. If we were to use some of our linkage fees to set up some sort of program where they could retrofit if they guarantee, you know, for say a 0 interest loan or something that rolled, because I think financing is going to be really, really hard on this. I look at the gap here with banking and finance, and the person I think that knows the most about it is Ricardo, frankly, Councilman Ortiz. He's dealing with this every single day in his job. So I think he would have a really interesting perspective on this. But you know, if the property owners are having a hard time getting that financing, you know, we may end up, as you say, being a municipal source that can step in. I just don't know where our capital could be, but possibly from that. If then the property owners agreed, and I think the mayor has brought this up in the past, this kind of a program where then, you know, those rents are kept at that level or something around that for, say, a certain number of years, and then we help either pay or then forgive or something like that.
Yeah, I think that definitely merits looking into as an option for a program. I could imagine you know, where a low interest or some sort of loan is offered, and we'd have to, you know, make sure that we can fund it out of the commercial linkage fees. But I think if there is that nexus to the affordable housing, and then, you know, part of the assistance with the retrofit is to keep the rent stabilized for a certain amount of time at a certain income, which particularly if it's a naturally affordable building, maybe they're already at that rent to begin with, that has a lot of potential. So I think that would be something that, and I know it has been mentioned by Mayor O'Brien in the past. So I think that would be something we would be interested in. And it's probably a little more practical than just cash in terms of what the city can offer. And so I think that those kinds of solutions are, I think, what we would find interesting.
Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions? My question to Director Gardner, I have two questions. One is, what outreach will be, these ad hoc committee meetings would be open to the public, correct?
That's right, yes.
So what is what is the outreach going to be? Because I think it's going to be very important that we get as many people educated on what the ad hoc committee is going to be doing, because these are big decisions that will be made, and you do want your apartment owners, property owners to know about this?
So I think, that's something we could look at with the work program. I think the ad hoc committee was really meant to be more of a working group. So it is open to the public, but it's not quite the same as a community meeting. If we feel that a community meeting, which is broader, certainly the ad hoc committee is meant to be representative. So we do want, representatives of kind of every corner, but at the same time, then it's representative. So I think if we find that it makes sense to have a broader community engagement, where particularly if some draft policies and programs are put together and we want to share those with the broader community, we can build that into the work program as well.
Yeah, I do think it's going to be important that they are educated on this. And it may be, like you said, a draft maybe is put together and then it's opened up to a community meetings for a little bit more feedback. I do find it interesting when you look at the list, the people most affected would be the apartment building owners, and we don't have anyone representing them. So if we have suggestions, should we email those to you? And if so, what would the deadline be on that?
It's really, it's kind of as soon as possible. I wouldn't say it's, like urgent, but we are trying to put the committee together and start them, at least start their first meeting. So if, in the next week or two, if we can get suggestions. I do want to mention that we, and just this afternoon, got agreement from a representative from the California Apartment Association, who has very graciously agreed to be on the committee. And in fact, she said she has been dealing with this matter for quite some time and is very knowledgeable and understands a lot of the nuances. So we now certainly she is representative of the association and the industry, but I felt good to hear that this has been on her radar and she has some constructive things to add. That said, we do want to have, and it doesn't have to just be one property owner. If there are apartment owners who would want to be on this committee and would find it useful, we certainly send me their names and we can be in touch with them and provide them with more information.
Very good. Thank you, Director Gardner. I do have a few people that fit 3 categories, so I will send those to you tomorrow. Great.
And the people, one question we had from one person was, I'm in more than one category. Is that okay? Is that a conflict? And it's okay. Unless it's a classic conflict of interest, that's just the nature of this. It may be that somebody is in real estate and also a property owner, and that's okay. We're trying to kind of get the range of perspectives here.
Very good. Thank you, Director. Do we have anyone from the public, City Clerk?
We do, Mayor O'Brien. I got an email from former Mayor Thierry Nagel, and she says, the Burlingame Neighborhood Network strongly supports the city's exploration of options for making soft story buildings safer, as they present a significant seismic risk. We are pleased that one prospective member of the ad hoc committee is Janelle Maffei, Chief Mitigation Officer of the California Earthquake Authority, who is a recognized expert on this topic and would likely offer many helpful suggestions. She was the featured speaker at a BNN program a few years ago, and she was very impressive. And she also states, in a PS, our emergency coordinator with CCFD, Dina Gunning, has lots of experience with dealing with this issue in Oakland. And I don't have any other chats or emails, and I don't see any members of the public with their hand up.
Thank you. I do see Councilmember Beaches has raised her hand.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I just have a comment, and I want to really appreciate staff and colleagues for really tackling this. This is a big issue. I think the vision and the general plan is the right one to figure out how are we going to keep our people and our buildings as safe as possible. I found the preliminary candidate scope to know we've got about 140 of these buildings helpful just to understand the scope of it. And that's a lot of buildings. And certainly we know that anecdotally in the city, but that's kind of good to at least know a starting point of potential candidates. I really appreciate the mayor's comments about the importance of extensive outreach. And I think the stakeholder group list looks really good. I'm delighted some of these organizations are represented, like the Apartment Association and Sam Carr, so that they can hopefully communicate this work that's happening through their networks as well as just having individual representatives. So I think those organizations are really important. I think the toughest nut to crack, and I think Councilmember Coulson really alluded to it, the toughest nut to crack is how do we craft a really thoughtful policy. And so this is just my 2 cents of one of the things we really need to explore in the stakeholder committee. How do we craft a really thoughtful policy that gets to the end goal of improving safety for lives of people and safety of buildings, but that doesn't have all these unintended consequences of losing our naturally affordable housing stock and our naturally affordable commercial property, or does it in a way that creates tools and incentives and gets the job done. And I think this huge stakeholder group, although large as it will be, is a really important part of that puzzle, so that the policy is thoughtful and tools are provided. So I commend everybody for tackling it and look forward to the work ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Beach. Okay, on that note, we can move on to item number 11, Council Committee and Activities Reports and Announcements. Does anyone want to make any announcement that was not in our packet? If not, any future agenda items? Any acknowledgements for this evening? Okay, so then on that.
Madam Mayor, through the mayor, I'm sorry, I do have an acknowledgement.
Go ahead.
And I saw it briefly in the paper right before the meeting, but there was a column that Sue Lempert wrote today about one of our Burlingame residents who passed away. I think it was December 19th, Paul Constantino. And I didn't know that. I just read it quickly and I would have been more prepared to speak to it, but he really was a pretty, just an upbeat, amazing guy, good-natured. I didn't know him well. Maybe some of you knew him better. I'm so glad to hear he passed peacefully in his sleep. But that one of the interactions that I remember the most with him is that he was a veteran and a proud veteran, and many of his children are veterans as well. And it was his idea. When I was initially precinct walking in Burlingame, he said, we should acknowledge veterans in this community. And when really he had the idea of doing the Veterans Day ceremony, or at least that's how it came about, that we do, that I think is something we all really appreciate doing every year and acknowledging the veterans in the community. And I believe his daughter, we acknowledged in the first year, Mayor O'Brien, when you were mayor that year, 2016. And it's just become a wonderful tradition. And he was a Vietnam vet, and Sue Lempert's article said that he made it out and he dedicated his life to making the world a better place and making people happy. And he was really a wonderful man and from a wonderful family. So I just wanted to make sure we acknowledge that in a timely way. Thank you.
Can I just quickly add a PS to Council Member Beach's comments? I appreciate her reminding us that Mr. Constantino passed. I had the good fortune of working with him in Little League Baseball, and he was one of those just perfect parents who had nothing but encouragement for every child on the field, and also a lot of encouragement for the coaches. And he was one of those parents, when you saw him in the audience, you went, yay. You know, there's always a few parents who you're like, oh, I hope they could keep their mouth closed this time. But Mr. Constantino was a joy and a gentleman, and we do all miss him.
Thank you, Councilmember Brownrigg. Actually, I know Mr. Constantino from Our Lady of Angels Parish, and you would always see him usually after the 8:30 Mass, telling jokes to all the kids as they were coming out of church. So very sorry to hear that he passed. I do see a raised hand by Councilmember Coulson.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you, Councilwoman Beach, for reminding me of this. We did get a lovely obituary from the Rotary. Marilyn Orr sent that on over because I do believe Mr. Constantino was also a member of the Rotary. And it looks as though they held a small private burial on December 30th, but will do a celebration of life will take place later in 2021, as are many of these kinds of activities. So if anybody is interested in looking this up, I believe this was, you can contact the Burlingame Rotary and they will give you all the information. Marilyn Orr. And this is run in the Mercury News. So if anybody needs to look that up for information, it's there.
Thank you, Councilmember Coulson. So let us take a minute to reflect. Before we adjourn, I just want to mention that our next City Council meeting will be on Tuesday, January 19th. So thank you, everyone. We have gone through our first meeting for January 2021 and look forward to seeing you all again in 2 weeks. Have a good night.